"No one saves girls like you," Lord Victor Harrow had said, and then he had left Clara Whitmore to learn whether the snow agreed with him. The carriage lamps were already fading into the storm, two weak yellow eyes swallowed by the white fury of the northern road, and Clara lay where she had fallen, one gloved hand pressed against the frozen ground, the other locked around the small silver box hidden beneath her torn wool cloak. Snow struck her face in sharp, stinging flakes. It gathered along her lashes, slipped beneath her collar, and crept into the seams of her worn boots, as if the winter itself had fingers. For a moment she could not remember how to breathe. The world had become wind, darkness, and the terrible emptiness left behind by retreating wheels. She tried to rise. Her knees refused her. She tried again because Whitmore women did not beg, not even when abandoned on a road 20 miles from the nearest village, not even when the man who should have protected them had smiled while delivering them to death. Clara pushed one hand into the snow and forced herself upright, though the motion sent a pale wave of dizziness through her. The road beneath her was already disappearing, each track filled and softened by the storm, erasing the proof of what Lord Harrow had done. That frightened her more than the cold. By morning there might be no marks, no witness, no truth. Only a girl found too late, clutching a secret no one had thought important enough to save. She drew the silver box closer to her chest. It was no larger than a prayer book, its edges cold even through fabric, its lock sealed with a mark her father had touched on the night before he died. "If anything happens to me," Thomas Whitmore had whispered, his voice thin as candle smoke, "find Blackwell." At the time Clara had thought grief had tangled his mind. The Blackwell name belonged to ruin and scandal, to a fallen duke who lived beyond the Black Pines in a castle people avoided after sunset. No respectable person in Northumberland spoke of Duke Adrian Blackwell unless the room was already heavy with whispers. Yet now, with the storm closing around her and Lord Harrow's final words still cutting deeper than the wind, that forbidden name was the only direction left in the world. Blackwell. Clara took one step, then another. Her skirts dragged through the snow, heavy with ice. Her breath came in short white bursts that vanished almost before they existed. Somewhere beyond the trees, a branch cracked under the weight of winter, and the sound made her turn too quickly. Nothing moved. Nothing but snow. She swallowed the fear rising in her throat and pressed forward, following what she hoped was the road toward Black Pine Ridge. The cold worked patiently. It numbed her fingers first, then her feet, then the edges of thought itself. Memories came in fragments. Her father's hand trembling over the silver box, Lord Harrow's polished boots beside the study fire, the unsigned papers spread before her, his voice soft with false regret. "You have no home unless I permit you one." She had refused him, quietly, completely, and that refusal had brought her here, beneath a sky with no stars. A gust of wind tore back her hood, spilling pale hair across her cheek. Clara stopped beside a leaning milestone half buried in white. The carved letters were rimmed with frost, but she could make out one word through the storm: Ravenshade. 5 miles. 5 miles might as well have been an ocean. Her strength loosened all at once, slipping from her body like thread from torn cloth. She lowered herself beside the stone, not because she meant to rest, but because standing had become impossible. The silver box remained against her heart. Snow settled over her shoulders. The road blurred. In the distance, so faint she thought it might be a dream, came the sound of a bell, slow and solemn, as though some unseen church were counting the last breaths of the night. Clara closed her eyes. "Father," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "I tried to find him." The wind answered for the dead. Then, far beyond the veil of snow, something darker than the storm moved between the trees. The dark shape beyond the snow did not come closer. It waited between the pines like a memory Clara was not strong enough to face, and before she could decide whether it was man, beast, or mercy, the storm folded over it and took it away. Her eyes fluttered open against the sting of ice. She was still beside the milestone. Ravenshade remained 5 impossible miles ahead, and the silver box was still trapped beneath her hand, pressed so tightly against her ribs that its cold corners had begun to ache through the fabric of her dress. She had not always known how much a house could matter. Whitmore House had never been grand by the standards of dukes and earls, but to Clara it had been a world entire. The narrow staircase polished by generations of careful footsteps. The kitchen window where her mother grew rosemary in cracked blue pots. The parlor clock that lost 7 minutes every winter and gained them again by spring. After her mother died, her father had kept the house alive with quiet discipline and a grief so gentle it never asked to be seen. Then came the debts, the letters, the visits from men with smooth gloves and hard eyes. Then came Lord Victor Harrow. He arrived 3 weeks after the funeral in a black carriage that looked too expensive for a grieving relative. Clara remembered standing in the study while snow tapped softly against the window, watching him remove his hat with the patience of a man entering a room he already believed belonged to him. "My dear Clara," he had said, his voice warm enough to shame a fireplace, "you must allow me to manage matters now." Matters had meant the ledgers. Matters had meant the servants dismissed one by one. Matters had meant her father's desk locked, her mother's silver inventoried, and every room measured by men who spoke of value without once speaking of memory. Clara had endured it because grief had made the world slow, and because Victor carried documents stamped by lawyers from Boston and New York, papers with seals and signatures that looked official enough to frighten honest people. But on the final night, while the house slept beneath a hard December moon, she had found the drawer her father had hidden behind the lower shelf of his bookcase. Inside was the silver box, wrapped in a linen handkerchief, and beneath it a letter written in his failing hand. The words had been few. "Trust no claim Harrow makes. The truth is with Blackwell." Clara had barely finished reading when Victor appeared in the doorway. He did not shout. That would have been easier to bear. He only looked at the box, then at her face, and something kind died behind his eyes. By morning, the papers were laid before her on the study table. The fire burned low. The housekeeper had been sent away on an errand. Victor stood with one hand resting on the chair that had once been her father's and explained that a young woman without protection could be ruined by rumor, by debt, by a single accusation spoken in the proper drawing room. "Sign," he said, sliding the pen toward her. Clara looked at the page. It would surrender Whitmore House, the land behind it, the remaining accounts, and any future claim she might possess. Her name waited at the bottom like an open grave. "No," she said. It was not loud. It did not tremble. Victor studied her for a long moment, and the silence between them became colder than the window glass. Then he smiled. "Then we shall take you somewhere you may reconsider." Now, alone on the white road, Clara understood. There had never been any aunt in the north. There had never been mercy. Only distance, weather, and a winter deep enough to hide what a polite man had done. Her breath caught painfully as she forced her fingers to move around the silver box. She could no longer feel the tips of them. Still, she would not let go. If Blackwell was ruin, then ruin was all she had left. Clara pressed her palm into the snow and tried to rise once more. This time she made it only halfway before the world tilted. The milestone blurred. The trees leaned close. Somewhere ahead, through the storm, a horse gave a sharp, restless sound, and a man's voice, low and controlled, cut through the wind. There, by the stone. The man's voice reached Clara before the man himself, and for one fragile instant she wondered whether the dead spoke in the same tone as nobleman, calm, distant, and unbearably sure of being obeyed. The horse gave another uneasy sound. Snow shifted beneath heavy boots. Clara tried to turn her head, but the motion cost more strength than she possessed, and the world narrowed to the gray stone before her, the white blur beyond it, and the silver box locked beneath her failing hand. "Miss," the voice said, closer now. "Can you hear me?" She wanted to answer. Her lips parted, but only a thin breath escaped. A shadow fell across the snow. Not Victor, not the driver. This man was taller, broader through the shoulders, wrapped in a black riding coat dusted with white. Frost clung to the brim of his hat and the dark edges of his hair. He knelt beside her with a controlled urgency that seemed almost at war with the cold restraint of his face. Clara saw only fragments at first, a gloved hand brushing snow from her sleeve, a silver signet ring, eyes the color of winter iron. Behind him, a lantern swung from the saddle of a restless black horse, its flame trembling as though afraid of the storm. "She is alive," the man said, not to her, but to someone behind him. Another figure moved near the road, older, wrapped in a servant's cloak, holding the reins. "Your Grace," the The ridge road is nearly buried. We must turn back now. Your Grace. The words moved through Clara slowly, striking one thought awake inside her. Blackwell. She forced her fingers tighter around the box. The Duke looked down and saw the movement. His gaze dropped to the object half hidden beneath her cloak, and something changed in his expression so quickly that she might have imagined it. A stillness. A recognition. Where did you get that? He asked. His voice had not risen, yet it cut through the wind more sharply than any shout. Clara tried to speak, but cold had stolen language from her. The Duke leaned closer, not enough to frighten, only enough to hear. Snow gathered on the dark line of his collar. Who left you here? The question should have opened the whole terrible truth. Victor's smile, the locked study, the papers, the false promise of shelter, the carriage turning where no carriage should turn. Instead, Clara's mind slipped backward into the hours before the road, when Blackpine Ridge had first appeared through the carriage window, and fear had begun its quiet work. Lord Harrow had sat opposite her, immaculate in his fur-lined coat, watching the snow thicken beyond the glass. He had spoken pleasantly of distant relatives, of proper arrangements, of the need for obedience in uncertain times. Clara had kept both hands folded in her lap, the silver box hidden beneath the loose wool of her cloak. Every mile had carried them farther from Whitmore House. Every turn had made the driver more silent. When the carriage left the main road, Clara had looked up. This is not the Northern Turnpike. Victor's smile had been gentle enough for church. You have become suspicious, my dear. Where are you taking me? Somewhere quiet. Somewhere you may reconsider your position without the sentimental influence of old furniture and dead men's letters. The carriage had rolled beneath black pines, their branches bent low with snow, until even the sky disappeared. Clara had understood then that fear did not always arrive as a scream. Sometimes it entered as certainty. She had reached for the door handle, but Victor had placed his cane across the latch. Do not embarrass yourself. My father told me to find Blackwell, she had said before she could stop herself. The warmth left his face. For the first time, Lord Harrow looked truly afraid. Then he ordered the driver to stop. The memory broke as the Duke's hand closed gently but firmly around her wrist, testing the faint pulse beneath her skin. Clara stared at him through lashes heavy with ice. The name rose from somewhere deeper than strength. Blackwell, she whispered. The Duke went completely still. Even the servant seemed to stop breathing. Clara gathered the last of herself around the warning her father had died to leave behind. He wanted the box, she breathed. Do not give it to Harrow. At that name, the Duke's eyes hardened with a silence older than the storm. He looked toward the road where the carriage tracks had nearly vanished, then back at Clara, and for the first time his cold face showed something like decision. Harrow, he said softly, as if tasting a poison he had known before. Then he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, lifting her from the snow with careful strength. Clara should have been afraid. A ruined Duke was carrying her into a night no safer than the one that had almost taken her. Yet as her head fell against the dark wool of his coat, she felt warmth for the first time in hours. Not comfort, not trust, only the faint, impossible knowledge that she had reached the name her father had given her. The older servant stepped back as the Duke turned toward the horse. Ravenshade, your Grace? He asked. Duke Adrian Blackwell looked down at the silver box still trapped in Clara's hand. Yes, he said, and no one is to know she survived. The ride to Ravenshade Castle seemed to pass through a world that had forgotten every color but black and white. Clara drifted in and out of awareness, held securely against Duke Adrian Blackwell's chest while the horse moved with careful power through the deepening snow. The older servant rode close behind, his lantern swinging in the wind, casting brief circles of gold over the buried road before darkness reclaimed them. Clara could not lift her head, but she felt the Duke's coat beneath her cheek, heavy wool warmed by the life still moving through him. He did not speak to soothe her. He did not offer promises. Yet each time the horse stumbled over hidden ice, his arm tightened just enough to keep her from slipping, and that silent steadiness felt more honest than any comfort Lord Harrow had ever offered. Above them, the pines bent beneath the storm. Their branches scraped together like whispered warnings. Somewhere far behind, the last traces of Victor Harrow's carriage were vanishing beneath fresh snow, and with them the polite version of the world Clara had once believed in. There were no drawing rooms here, no lawyers with clean cuffs, no relatives speaking of duty while stealing the roof over a grieving girl's head. There was only the road, the cold, the locked silver box, and the fallen duke who had heard Harrow's name as if it had awakened an old wound. Adrian Blackwell did not look at Clara as they rode, but his mind had returned to a night 12 years earlier, when another sealed box had arrived too late, and another innocent name had been dragged through the parlors of New York and Boston with enough elegance to make cruelty sound like truth. His younger sister, Evelyn, had begged him not to trust Victor Harrow. Adrian had dismissed the warning as the fear of a girl too gentle for politics. By spring, Evelyn was gone from society, the Blackwell title was stained, and Harrow had risen higher with every whisper he pretended not to spread. Since then, Adrian had lived at Ravenshade not because he feared the world, but because he no longer trusted himself to care what it thought. Then Clara Whitmore had appeared beside a milestone, half covered in snow, clutching a box marked with a crest he had not seen in years. Whitmore. Her father had once served as a quiet witness to transactions no gentleman admitted making. If Thomas Whitmore had sent his daughter to Blackwell, then the dead were not finished speaking. The castle emerged at last from the storm, high on the ridge like a dark ship fixed in ice. Its towers rose against the clouded sky, their windows lit unevenly, some glowing with firelight, others black as sealed eyes. Ravenshade was not beautiful in the way fashionable houses were beautiful. It was older than fashion, built of gray stone and stubborn grief, with iron gates that opened only after the servant gave 3 hard pulls on the bell chain. The sound rolled through the night, deep and solemn. By the time they crossed the courtyard, 2 footmen had appeared beneath the entrance arch, their faces startled by the sight of their master carrying a young woman through the storm. Not a word beyond this house, Adrian said before either man could speak. His voice was low, but every servant understood the weight inside it. The great doors opened. Warm air touched Clara's face and made the cold in her skin burn. She heard the crackle of distant fireplaces, smelled beeswax, old wood, rain-damp stone, and the faint medicinal sharpness of herbs kept for winter illness. The entrance hall rose above her in shadowed height, lined with portraits hidden beneath dark cloth. A silver candelabrum trembled on a carved table as the wind followed them inside and died against the closing doors. Clara's lashes lifted. For one blurred moment, she saw a veiled portrait at the turn of the staircase and thought the covered woman was watching her. Then Adrian carried her past the watching servants and toward the east wing, where no guest had slept in years. "Mrs. Vale," he called. A woman in a black dress appeared at once, pale with alarm but disciplined enough not to ask the wrong question. "Warm blankets. Heated water. Send for Dr. Merritt quietly. Use the old road. No messenger from the village." "Yes, Your Grace." Clara stirred at the unfamiliar voices. Her fingers tightened around the box. Adrian felt the movement and looked down. Her eyes opened only a little, blue-gray and clouded with exhaustion. "Do not let him take it," she whispered. The words were barely sound. Adrian paused beneath an archway where candlelight cut across his face, revealing the tired severity of a man who had spent years refusing every plea until this one. "No one will take anything from you here," he said. Clara seemed to hear him, or perhaps only the shape of safety in his voice. Her hand loosened by a fraction, though the silver box remained against her heart. Behind them, unnoticed by all but the covered portraits, a young stable boy slipped from the edge of the hall into the servants' corridor, his face white with fear and purpose. Before the east wing door closed, he had already decided that Lord Harrow must be told the girl was alive. For 3 hours, Ravenshade Castle held its breath around Clara Whitmore. Snow pressed against the windows of the east wing until the glass looked buried in white, and the fire in the guest chamber burned with a fierce orange light that made the old carved bed, the faded blue curtains, and the silver basin beside the hearth seem almost alive. Mrs. Vale moved quietly from table to bedside, warming cloths, measuring drops from a brown glass bottle, and murmuring instructions to the maid who had been sworn to silence before she entered. Clara lay beneath layers of wool and linen, her pale face turned toward the fire, her damp hair spread across the pillow like threads of winter moonlight. The silver box had not left her reach. Even when Mrs. Vale tried to ease it from her stiff fingers, Clara's hand tightened with a fear deeper than sleep. In the end, the housekeeper placed it on the coverlet beside her, where her fingertips could touch the cold metal and believe it had not been stolen. Duke Adrian Blackwell stood near the window, one shoulder hidden in shadow, watching the storm bury the courtyard stones. He should have returned to his study. He should have allowed the servants to manage an unexpected guest, as any sensible gentleman would have done. Instead, he remained because the name Harrow had walked back into his house wearing the face of a half-frozen girl. Dr. Merritt arrived through the old road shortly after midnight, his coat white with snow, his spectacles fogged from the sudden warmth. He examined Clara with gentle efficiency and spoke in a lowered voice. She needs rest, heat, and quiet. The cold nearly claimed her, but not fully. She is young, and she was stubborn enough to keep breathing. Adrian looked toward the bed. Will she wake? I believe so. The doctor closed his bag. But when she does, do not press her too hard. Whatever sent her into that storm may have frightened her as much as the storm itself. Adrian said nothing. He knew fear when it hid behind silence. He had lived with it long enough to recognize its shape in another room. After the doctor left, Mrs. Vale approached with the careful expression of a woman who had served one family through too many secrets. Your Grace, there is more. Adrian turned from the window. What is it? She held out a folded scrap of paper, damp at one edge, the ink blurred but readable. It was sewn inside the lining of her cloak. The maid found it while drying the garment. Adrian took it. The paper was cheap, but the handwriting struck him like a bell through fog. Thomas Whitmore. He had seen that hand once before, on a statement that vanished before it could clear the Blackwell name. Only one sentence remained clear enough to read. My daughter carries what Harrow fears and what Blackwell lost. Adrian felt the years close around him. The covered portraits in the hall, Evelyn's final letter, the closed doors of society, the long discipline of not hoping. All of it stirred, not loudly, but with the soft, dangerous sound of a lock turning. On the bed, Clara shifted. Her lips moved without sound at first, then formed a whisper. Father. Mrs. Vale stepped toward her, but Adrian lifted one hand. He crossed the room himself, every footstep measured against the polished floor. Clara's eyes opened, unfocused and bright with feverish confusion. For a moment, she seemed not to know where she was. Then she saw the high ceiling, the dark furniture, the unfamiliar man beside the fire, and fear drew her fingers toward the silver box. You are at Ravenshade, Adrian said. You are safe. The word safe trembled in the room, as if it were a candle flame uncertain of the air. Clara looked at him more carefully. Recognition came slowly. The road, the horse, the arms that had lifted her from the snow. Blackwell, she breathed. Adrian Blackwell. His voice was steady. You asked for my family. Clara tried to rise and failed. Her pride flickered in her face, wounded by weakness more than by pain. Lord Harrow will come. Let him. The answer was too quiet to be arrogance, too cold to be comfort. Clara swallowed, her gaze moving from his face to the folded scrap in his hand. You found it. Mrs. Vale did. Adrian held the paper where she could see it. Your father wrote that you carry what Harrow fears. Clara's eyes filled, but no tears fell. I do not know how to open the box. He never gave me the key. Adrian looked down at the small silver object beside her hand. Its tarnished lid bore the Whitmore mark, but beneath it, nearly hidden by age, was another engraving, one he knew as well as his own blood, a black raven with its wings spread over a broken crown. The private seal of his sister Evelyn. For the first time in 12 years, Adrian Blackwell forgot to be cold. Before he could speak, a bell rang somewhere far below, sharp and urgent against the sleeping stone of the castle. Mrs. Vale turned pale. Adrian moved toward the door. In the corridor, hurried footsteps approached, and a footman's voice broke through the silence. Your Grace, a messenger has arrived from Lord Harrow. He says he has come for Miss Whitmore. The bell rang a second time before Adrian Blackwell reached the staircase, and the sound moved through Ravenshade Castle like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. Below, servants had gathered at the edge of the great hall, silent beneath the covered portraits and trembling candlelight, their faces turned toward the closed front doors where the storm beat its fists against the iron hinges. Adrian descended without haste. He had learned long ago that fear often dressed itself as urgency, and he refused to wear what Victor Harrow sent to his house. At the foot of the stairs, Mrs. Vale appeared behind him, pale but composed. "Miss Whitmore should not be disturbed," she said softly. "Then no one will disturb her." His voice carried just enough for the nearest footman to straighten. Adrian crossed the hall and nodded once. The doors opened. Wind rushed in first, flinging snow across the black marble floor. Behind it stood a thin young man in a traveling coat, his cheeks reddened by the cold, his hat gripped nervously in both hands. He was not Lord Harrow. Harrow would never spend his own skin on a dangerous errand when another man's fear could serve as carriage fare. The messenger bowed too quickly. "Your Grace, I bring a lawful request from Lord Victor Harrow, guardian and nearest male relation of Miss Clara Whitmore." Adrian did not invite him inside. "Speak." The young man swallowed and drew a sealed letter from inside his coat. "Lord Harrow has been informed that Miss Whitmore may have wandered onto your property during the storm. She is unwell, confused, and in need of family care. He requests that she be returned to him at once." Snow melted on the marble between them. Adrian looked at the seal, then at the messenger's shaking fingers. And who informed him she was here? The question struck harder than anger would have. The messenger's gaze flickered past him, toward the servants gathered in shadow. Somewhere among them, a stable boy lowered his eyes. Adrian saw it. He stored the knowledge away like a key. "I was not told, Your Grace." "Convenient." The young man offered the letter. Adrian took it, but did not break the seal. "Tell Lord Harrow that Miss Whitmore is under my roof by necessity of weather and condition. She will not be moved tonight." The messenger looked frightened enough to pity, but not enough to disobey the man who had sent him. My lord was most clear. He said delay would be considered interference in family affairs. A faint, humorless smile touched Adrian's mouth. "Lord Harrow has mistaken my silence for permission before." The hall seemed to grow colder. Even the candles bent in the draught. "Tell him this," Adrian continued. "Ravenshade returns no woman to a road that nearly buried her. If he believes he has a lawful claim, he may present it before a magistrate in daylight, with witnesses, papers, and a clean conscience if he can borrow one." The messenger's lips parted, but no reply came. Adrian held out the unopened letter. "Take it back." "Your Grace, he ordered me to place it in your hand, and I am ordering you to remove it from my house." The young man bowed again, this time lower. When the doors closed behind him, the storm's roar dulled to a distant, furious murmur. Adrian turned slowly toward the servants. No one spoke. His gaze found the stable boy, Samuel Pike, a narrow-shouldered lad of 17 who had come to Ravenshade the previous autumn with a sick mother in the village and debts no honest wage could satisfy. The boy's face drained of color. "Samuel," Adrian said. The name alone was enough. The boy stepped forward, his hands twisting at his cap. "Your Grace, I did not mean harm." Few cowards begin by meaning harm. They begin by hoping harm will choose someone else. Samuel's eyes shone with shame. "Lord Harrow's man promised medicine money for my mother. I only sent word that a lady had been brought in. I did not know he had left her." Adrian studied him for a long moment. In another life, rage might have been simple. Age and grief had made it less useful. "Mrs. Vale, see that his mother receives what she needs through Dr. Merritt. Samuel will remain in the south stable under Mr. Crane's supervision until I decide whether mercy has made him wiser." The boy bowed his head, too overcome to speak. Adrian turned toward the east wing. Above, Clara lay awake despite every order for rest. She had heard enough through the old walls to know Lord Harrow had already reached into the castle. When Adrian entered her chamber, she was sitting against the pillows, white-faced but steady, the silver box in both hands. "He will not stop," she said. "No." Adrian closed the door behind him. "Men like Harrow never stop because no one forces them to." Clara looked toward the fire, where orange light trembled over the tarnished lid. "Then why did my father send me to you?" Adrian crossed to the bedside table and placed beside her the scrap of Thomas Whitmore's letter. "Because 12 years ago, your father witnessed the beginning of my ruin, and my sister trusted him with the end of it." Clara's breath caught. The room seemed to draw in around them, velvet shadows, carved wood, snow-muted glass. Adrian looked at the silver box, and for once his voice lost its iron edge. "If that box bears Evelyn's seal, then it may contain the truth Harrow buried." Clara's fingers moved over the hidden engraving. "I do not have the key." Adrian's gaze lifted to hers. "No, he said quietly. But I know where my sister would have hidden it. Adrian Blackwell did not allow Clara to stand until Mrs. Vale wrapped her in a heavy robe of dark blue wool and placed warm stockings over her chilled feet. But even then he watched her with the grave suspicion of a man who believed courage could be as dangerous as weakness. Clara accepted the housekeeper's arm, not because she wished to appear fragile, but because her knees still remembered the snow. The silver box rested against her chest beneath the robe, wrapped in a linen cloth, its hidden seal seeming to burn through every layer between them. Outside the chamber, the east wing corridor waited in a hush of candlelight and old dust. No guest had crossed that passage in years. Clara could feel it in the air, in the covered mirrors, in the closed doors, in the way the servants had not polished the brass handles with the same devotion given to the rest of the castle. Ravenshade did not merely contain sorrow. It preserved it. Adrian walked ahead with a single candle, his black coat casting a long shadow over the faded carpet. He did not explain himself quickly. He seemed a man built out of things left unsaid. At last, he stopped before a narrow door near the end of the corridor, half hidden behind a tapestry showing a raven above a frozen field. His hand rested on the latch for a moment longer than necessary. "This was my sister's music room," he said. The words were plain, but Clara heard the restraint beneath them. Mrs. Vale lowered her eyes. Adrian opened the door. The room beyond was small and pale, untouched by time in the way only sealed rooms can be. A square piano stood near the window beneath a linen cover. Shelves of music books lined one wall. A vase of dried white roses sat on the mantel, brittle and colorless, yet still arranged as though someone might return to admire them. Clara stepped inside and felt the strange intimacy of entering another woman's silence. "Evelyn loved puzzles," Adrian said, crossing to the piano. "Locks, riddles, hidden drawers. She said people told the truth more safely when they had to hide it first." He lifted the linen cover. Dust rose in the candlelight. His fingers moved along the polished wood beneath the keys, searching by memory. For the first time since Clara had seen him, uncertainty touched his face. Not fear. Something worse. Hope resisted. A soft click answered him. A narrow drawer slid open from the piano's side. Inside lay a black velvet ribbon, a pressed violet, and a key no longer than Clara's thumb, darkened by age but unmistakably silver. Mrs. Vale released a breath she had been holding for 12 years. Adrian did not take the key at once. He looked at it as though it were a living thing capable of accusation. Clara understood then that whatever waited inside the box did not belong only to her father's final wish. It belonged to this man's buried life. She stepped closer, slow and careful, and held out the box with both hands. "You should open it," she said. Adrian's eyes lifted to hers. Candlelight carved the angles of his face, showing the exhaustion beneath his severity. "Your father trusted you to carry it, and he trusted you to understand it." For a moment neither moved. Wind pressed snow against the window with a soft, steady hiss. Then Adrian took the key and fitted it into the lock. The mechanism resisted, then yielded with a delicate sound that seemed too small for the change it brought. Inside the box lay a packet of letters tied with blue thread, a bank draft bearing Victor Harrow's signature, and a miniature portrait of a young woman with fair hair and kind, sorrowful eyes. Evelyn Blackwell. Beneath the portrait was a folded statement sealed in Thomas Whitmore's hand. Adrian opened it slowly. Clara watched the words travel across his face before she understood them. Disbelief, pain, then a stillness so deep it frightened her. "What does it say?" she whispered. Adrian's voice emerged low, almost unfamiliar. "That Harrow forged the documents that disgraced my family. That my sister tried to expose him. That your father hid the proof when he feared both of them would be silenced by scandal." Clara gripped the edge of the piano. The room tilted, not from weakness now, but from the terrible weight of truth arriving late. "Then my father was protecting yours, and mine failed to protect him." Adrian folded the paper with hands that no longer looked entirely steady. Before Clara could answer, hurried footsteps sounded in the corridor. Mrs. Vale turned sharply as the door opened, and Dr. Merritt appeared, his face drawn. "Your Grace," he said, glancing once at Clara before lowering his voice. "Lord Harrow has gone to the magistrate. By morning, he will come with legal papers and men to search Ravenshade." Adrian looked at the open box, then at Clara. The cold returned to his expression, But this time it was not emptiness. It was purpose. Then by morning, he said, Ravenshade will stop hiding from the world. By the time the eastern sky began to pale behind the storm clouds, Ravenshade Castle no longer resembled a house in mourning. Fires had been lit in every public room. The covered portraits in the great hall were uncovered one by one under Adrian's orders, their painted eyes returning to witness what the living had avoided for 12 years. Servants moved with quiet urgency through corridors that had slept too long, polishing silver, opening shutters, carrying coal, laying out chairs in the old receiving room where no guest of consequence had been welcomed since the Blackwell disgrace. Clara watched from the threshold, wrapped in Mrs. Vale's blue wool robe, the silver box secured beneath her hand, and the letters tied once more with Evelyn's faded thread. She should have been in bed. Every sensible person had told her so. Dr. Merritt had spoken gently. Mrs. Vale had looked severe, and even Adrian had paused at the corridor with the clear intention of ordering her back to rest. But Clara had met his gaze and said only, "My father hid the truth. I will not hide while it is spoken." After that, he had not argued. Something in his face had changed, not softness exactly, but recognition. He understood the dignity of a person who had been given nothing left to lose but her voice. The old receiving room faced the front drive, where snow lay in high white banks along the stone path. A long table had been placed near the hearth. Upon it rested the contents of the box: Thomas Whitmore's signed statement, the bank draft, Evelyn Blackwell's letters, and the miniature portrait. Adrian stood at the far end of the room, dressed in a dark morning coat, his hair still damp from the snow he had crossed while sending riders to wake two neighboring justices, Dr. Merritt's brother, who practiced law in the county seat, and a retired judge who owed Adrian's father a favor older than scandal. "Harrow will expect silence," Dr. Merritt said, warming his hands near the fire. "He has survived on it." Adrian looked toward the windows. "Then we shall disappoint him." Clara stood beside the table, reading one of Evelyn's letters for the third time. The handwriting was graceful, hurried near the end, and filled with a brave intelligence that made Clara ache for a woman she had never known. Evelyn had discovered forged transfers, false testimony, and payments disguised as charitable gifts. She had written Thomas Whitmore because he had handled ledgers for both households, and because, unlike most men in polite society, he had apparently feared dishonor less than he feared injustice. "She was not only protecting your family," Clara said quietly. Adrian turned. "No." His voice was low. "She was protecting yours as well." Clara touched her father's statement. All her life, she had thought Thomas Whitmore merely careful, merely kind, merely tired from debts he never explained. Now she saw him differently. A quiet man standing against a powerful one, hiding truth where his daughter might one day carry it farther than he could. The realization hurt, but it also steadied her. Outside, a horn sounded from the gate. Mrs. Vale went still. The servants in the hall fell silent, as if the castle itself had drawn breath. Adrian moved to the window. 3 carriages were making their way up the ridge road through the snow, one bearing the county magistrate's black crest, one carrying Lord Victor Harrow, and one filled with men who looked official enough to frighten people who had never learned the difference between law and intimidation. Clara's fingers closed around the edge of the table. For a moment the old fear returned, not as panic, but as the memory of Victor's voice beside the carriage door. "No one saves girls like you." Adrian came to stand beside her, not touching, yet near enough that the space between them felt guarded. "You need not face him alone," he said. Clara looked at the uncovered portraits, at Evelyn's miniature, at the papers her father had hidden, at the snow beyond the glass, where she had almost vanished without a name. "I know," she answered. The front doors opened below with a sound that rolled through Ravenshade like thunder under stone. Voices rose in the hall, Victor Harrow's among them, smooth and wounded with false concern. "I have come for my niece," he declared, "and for the stolen property she carried in her confusion." Adrian's expression became very calm. He took the silver box in one hand and offered Clara his arm with the other. She hesitated only long enough to feel the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders, then placed her hand lightly upon his sleeve. Together they stepped into the great hall, where Lord Harrow stood beneath the restored Blackwell portraits and saw, too late, that the girl he had left to disappear had entered the room beside the one man who no longer feared him. Lord Victor Harrow's face did not lose its composure at once. Men like him were trained to survive surprise with a smile, and for one polished second, he looked at Clara Whitmore as though finding her alive were not a disaster, but an inconvenience he had already prepared to explain. He stood near the center of the great hall in a dark traveling coat, snow melting from his shoulders onto the marble floor, with the county magistrate beside him and two clerks behind him carrying leather folders. "My dear Clara," he said softly, allowing sorrow to enter his voice as if he had purchased it for the occasion. "You have frightened us all terribly." Clara's hand rested on Adrian Blackwell's sleeve, light as breath, yet it kept her standing more surely than the floor beneath her feet. The old fear stirred when Victor spoke her name. It remembered the study, the carriage, the road, the impossible cold. But fear was not command. Not anymore. "I frightened no one by surviving," she said. A hush passed through the hall. The magistrate, a square-faced man named Mr. Alden, glanced from Clara to Adrian, then to the silver box in the Duke's hand. "Your Grace, Lord Harrow claims this young lady is unwell and that certain family documents were removed from Whitmore House without authority." Adrian placed the box on the long table beneath the uncovered portraits. "Then it is fortunate you came. The documents prefer witnesses." Victor's eyes narrowed by the smallest degree. "Old scandal dressed as evidence, I presume." Duke Blackwell has long searched for a way to repair his unfortunate reputation. "No," Clara said before Adrian could answer. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "My father searched for the truth before he died. I carried it because Lord Harrow tried to force me to sign away everything he meant to steal." Victor turned toward her with gentle reproach. "The storm has confused you. The storm did not write your name on the bank draft." Dr. Merritt stepped forward and laid the paper beside Thomas Whitmore's signed statement. The magistrate adjusted his spectacles. One clerk opened a folder. The room fell into the slow, dreadful silence of ink being read by honest eyes. Clara watched Victor's face while Mr. Alden examined the letters, the forged transfers, Evelyn Blackwell's account, and the dates her father had preserved with such careful courage. Each page removed a little more warmth from Victor's expression. His sympathy faded first, then his patience, then the noble injury he had worn so well. At last there remained only a man who had expected the snow to keep his secret and found instead that winter had delivered it to the one house he feared. "These papers require formal review," the magistrate said at last, but his tone had changed. It no longer bent toward Lord Harrow. "Until that review is complete, Miss Whitmore will not be placed in your custody, and no property connected to her inheritance will be transferred." Victor's jaw tightened. "You are making a grave mistake." Adrian's voice was colder than the windows. "No, we are correcting one." The words settled beneath the portraits like a verdict. Victor looked once at Clara, and in his eyes she saw the last remnant of the road where he had left her. Yet he could not reach her there. Not with Adrian beside her, not with her father's truth on the table, not with Evelyn Blackwell's letters watching from beyond death. The magistrate ordered his clerks to gather copies, and Lord Harrow was escorted from the hall not as a triumphant guardian, but as a man suddenly surrounded by questions he could no longer silence. When the doors closed behind him, Ravenshade did not cheer. It was not a house that knew how. It simply stood, vast and awake, while morning light broke weakly through the storm clouds and touched the uncovered faces of the Blackwell dead. Clara's strength faltered then, not from fear, but from the release of it. Adrian turned at once. "You should sit. I thought you did not give comfort." "I am learning the inconvenience of exceptions." The faintest warmth entered her tired eyes. Mrs. Vale brought a chair near the fire, and Clara lowered herself into it, the silver box resting open on her lap. Adrian stood beside the hearth, holding Evelyn's miniature with a gentleness Clara had not expected from such severe hands. "Your sister gave my father the truth," she said. "Your father gave it back to us." He looked at her then, not as a burden carried from the snow, not as a witness, not as a key to his ruined name, but as a woman whose courage had crossed 5 frozen miles before her body could. "And you carried it when no one had left you any reason to be brave." Clara looked toward the windows, where the white road had disappeared beneath fresh morning snow. "He said no one saves girls like me." Adrian's gaze followed hers. Then he never understood what kind of men are made by losing everything. Outside, the storm began to loosen its grip on the ridge. Inside, Ravenshade Castle held its first honest morning in 12 years. Clara did not know what justice would demand in the days ahead, nor what name society would give to the bond formed in cold, firelight, and truth. She only knew that the house no longer felt like a tomb, and the fallen duke beside her no longer looked like a man waiting for the world to forget him. Some hearts do not return to life and sunlight. Some learn to beat again in the quiet after the storm, when one wounded soul keeps another from vanishing.